All right, let's see how we can create a compose file from scratch. So for this lesson, I'm going to rename this file to underline Docker compose. We want to set it aside and create a new compose file from scratch. So here we have the new file called docker-compose, all in lowercase. Make sure to spell it properly. Otherwise, Docker compose is not going to find this file because this is the default name that Docker compose assumes. Okay. So YAML. Now, the first thing that we need to set here is the version property. What version should we use? Well, let's search for Docker compose file. On this page, you can see various compose file formats and their compatibility with Docker Engine. We are using the latest version of Docker Engine, so I want to use the latest compose file format so we have access to the latest features. So we're going to set this to 3.8. Now, here we need to wrap this number with double quotes. Otherwise, it will be evaluated as a number. But Docker Compose expects this value to be a string. Why? I have no clue. So here's the version. Now, in this file, we define various building blocks or services of our application. So we have a property called services. Now, what services do we need here? Well, our application has a front end, a back end, and a database. Now, your application might have other moving parts, so you can define them here. Now, these names are arbitrary, so we can call them anything. We can change this to DB, we can change the backend to API, and the front end to web. The idea here is that we're defining various services and telling Docker how to build images for each service and how to run these images. So here we're going to have properties, and the value of these properties will eventually be used when running our containers. So in the previous section, we had to manually run our containers using Docker run. And here we used parameters like -p for port mapping or -v for volume mapping. We also had to specify an image like React app. All these values can be defined in our compose file. So we don't have to manually start our containers. Docker compose will take care of starting our containers under the hood. Okay. So for each service, we need to tell Docker how to build an image for that service. So here we can use the build property and tell Docker compose where it can find a Docker file. So if you look at this project, you can see that in our backend and frontend folders, we have a Docker file. This Docker file is almost identical to the one we created in the previous section. So we start from a node image, we create a user, we set our working directory, copy all the files and install the dependencies, then expose port 3001 and start the web server. We have a similar Docker file in our frontend project. Let's have a quick look. So that was the backend, here's the frontend, and here we have a Docker file, almost identical. But the front-end application or the front-end server starts on a different port. That is the only difference. So each service should have its own Docker file, okay? Now, back to our compose file. For our web or front-end, we're going to set the build property to period, meaning current folder, /frontend. This is where we have a Docker file. For our API, we're going to set build to backend. Now for our database, we're not going to build an image. We're going to pull an image from Docker Hub. So instead of the build property, we're going to use the image property. Now for this application, I'm going to use Mongo version 4.0-Xenial. So that is Mongo version 4 built on top of Xenial, which is Ubuntu version 16. Now if you look at Docker Hub, you can see that Mongo also has images built on top of Windows, but Windows images are very large, over 2 gigabytes. So that's why I prefer to use Linux images. So for any of these services, we can either build an image or pull it down. Now here we also have port mappings. So we set ports to. Now because we can have multiple port mappings, here we need to use the array or list syntax. So we use a hyphen and then define a port mapping. So our front-end application starts on port 3000. So I want to map port 3000 of the host to port 3000 of the container running this image. Now, similarly for our API, we're going to define a port mapping. This one is going to be 3001 to 3001. Now, MongoDB by default listens on port 27017. So I want to map the same port so we can access MongoDB using a MongoDB client like MongoDB Compass. Now, if you don't use MongoDB, you have the same concept with other database engines. All these database engines listen on a default port. You want to map that port so you can connect to your database engine using your favorite database client. Okay? What else do we have here? Back to this page for Compose file. If you look at version 3, on the right, you can see all valid properties. Now, a lot of these are for really special cases, so you don't need to use them all the time, but the ones that we use most of the time are build or image. You also use ports, volumes, environment, and so on. So our API project needs an environment variable that tells where our database is. So here we set environment. Now here we can use the list syntax because we can have multiple environment variables. So we set db underline URL to, here we need to type a MongoDB connection string. These connection strings always start with MongoDB : 2 forward slashes. Here we need to type the name of a host. So as I will show you later in this section, when we start an application with Docker Compose, under the hood, a network is created. On this network, we're going to have 3 hosts. The name of these hosts are equal to the names we have defined here. So we're going to have a host called DB. So that is the connection string to our MongoDB server. Now, on this server, we can have multiple databases. So we're going to specify the database name and the connection string as well. So this is one way to set an environment variable. But instead of using the list syntax, we can also use the object or property value syntax. So we get rid of the hyphen. We say DB URL is a property, and this is the value of that property. I find the syntax more readable because we get color coding and it's just cleaner. Similarly, we can add additional environment variables. Now, we're almost there. The last thing we want to add here is a volume, because we don't want MongoDB to write data to the temporary file system of the container. So here we set volumes. And again, we can have one or more volume mappings. So we add a hyphen. We're going to map a volume called Vidly, and of course we can call it anything. Vidly is the name of this application, in case you didn't notice. So we're going to map this volume to a directory inside the container. Now, if you look at the documentation of MongoDB on Docker Hub or just a typical MongoDB documentation, you know that by default, MongoDB stores its data in /data/db. So we want to map this volume to this directory. So whatever that is written inside this directory is actually outside of this container. It's somewhere else in our volume. Now, because we have used this volume here, we have to define it in our compose file. So we press enter, remove all the indentations. So now we are at the same level as services. Here we're going to define another property called volumes. And here we're going to add another property called Vidly with no value. I know this looks a little bit weird, but this is the syntax we have to follow. We just have to define the volume first before we can use it. So this is our compose file. Now we can make this more readable by adding line breaks in between these properties. We can also order these services any way we want. So currently I'm ordering them from front to back. We can also order them from back to front. So we will put database first, then API, and then web. So we're done with our compose file. Next, I'm going to show you how to build the images.